Now, our next case is a bizarre one. It involves hip joints, a high-tech microscope, and a more than £500,000 fraud.
The NHS, a cornerstone of British society that has safeguarded the nation's health for more than 7 decades. But while staff work tirelessly to provide world-class care for their patients, the NHS is under threat.
It's estimated that fraud costs the NHS over £1 billion a year.
To tackle the problem, the NHS has its own dedicated fraud investigation teams. Gemma Quemby and Mark Howard work for the Counter Fraud Authority team, which investigates the most serious and complex cases. In 2017, they were asked to reopen an investigation into a manager at St Albans City Hospital who had previously been suspected of fraud.
Hassan Abushaker was employed as a theatre manager for the Hertfordshire Trust. He'd worked for the Trust for around 6 years. It was his role to procure items that the department needed.
Gemma and Mark began by reviewing the original investigation, which had been carried out by the local fraud team.
Hertfordshire NHS Trust required a spinal microscope. These types of microscopes are very large, complex pieces of instrumentation, and they usually cost between £50,000 and £70,000. Mr. Abushaker offered to source one from abroad, and he said that he could obtain a microscope for approximately £20,000.
At first glance, the documentation suggested that Hassan Abushaker intended to buy the microscope from a specialty hospital in Jordan. But when staff took a closer look, they became suspicious.
The invoices were missing details of the specialty hospital itself. The emails that sent the invoices were from a Yahoo email address, and crucially, when staff looked at who had created the documentation, it was linked to Hassan Abushaker.
The hospital decided not to go ahead with the suspicious purchase, but it turned up at the hospital unexpectedly.
This understandably confused the staff. What then proceeded to happen was the specialty hospital were chasing for payment from this microscope.
A number of invoices were submitted to the trust, starting at £20,000, and these rose incrementally to £55,000. But the trust couldn't verify that the invoices were genuine.
As a result, they did not pay for this microscope, and at some point the microscope vanished.
Because the trust had lost no money, the case was left unresolved. But 4 years on, Gemma and Mark were asked to take a second look.
This coincided with a tip-off being given to police about a large amount of stolen hospital equipment being at Mr. Abushaker's address.
Hi there. Are you Hassan?
Yes.
Hello, Hassan. Do you want to step in and have a chat?
When police went to search his home, they found boxes and boxes of medical equipment and machinery that belonged to St Albans City Hospital.
Officers seized electrical devices such as mobile phones, laptop used by Mr. Abushaker. These were then taken to our forensics lab, who were able to download the content of these. This gave us some really good insight into what had happened with the microscope.
The evidence showed that the microscope hadn't come from a hospital in Jordan at all. Instead, Hassan Abushaker had bought it himself from an auction house for £11,000 before trying to sell it on fraudulently to the NHS at a profit of £44,000.
It became clear that this whole operation had been planned and implemented by Mr. Abushaker.
After cataloguing the contents of the boxes seized from his home, investigators found around £64,000 worth of medical supplies, from knee replacements to ankle plates.
There was a vast amount of medical equipment and implants relating to orthopedics, screws and spinal implants as well. There was enough to fill up a whole evidence room.
When investigators looked into his financial records, they found even more incriminating evidence.
What we discovered was a litany of wrongness.
We found that Mr. Abhishekar had been receiving large payments from suppliers who supplied the Hertfordshire NHS Trust.
Two of those suppliers were run by businessman Elmo Emanuel. And after investigators examined records of his dealings with Abhishekar, they realised he had been bribing the hospital manager in exchange for preferential treatment.
Emails and text messages we came across made the arrangement they had crystal clear, really, from an investigation point of view. They were talking about specific order numbers, they were talking about how much of a percentage that Hassan would be awarded for ordering. It really was a treasure trove of evidence from that respect.
The evidence suggested the corrupt arrangement had been going on for 5 years.
Over the period from 2012 to his arrest in April 2017, Mr. Emanuel's companies had provided orders totaling £250,000 to the hospital where Hassan Abhishekar was the manager.
They also found evidence suggesting Abhishekar made money out of medical equipment that had been donated to the trust.
What became clear when we was looking at Mr. Abhishekar's behaviour, he was really only motivated by personal gain.
Investigators estimated they were dealing with a substantial fraud against the NHS.
When you looked at opportunities that he'd been exploiting along the way, you realised the size of the fraud really had exploded into something quite significant. The value totalled over £600,000.
In May this year, Elmo Emanuel was sentenced to 2 years, 4 months in prison. And Hassan Abhishekar was sentenced to 11 years.
It was quite a relief to know that all that hard work had not gone to waste, and that someone who had taken a substantial amount of money out of the NHS over a period of 5 years would no longer be in a position to do so.
It's hard to believe that people are openly trying to defraud something as cherished as the NHS. Well, I'm with Alex Rothwell now from the NHS Counter-Fraud Authority. Alex, good morning. What sorts of cases do you see in your role?
Yeah, thanks, Rav. We've mapped 123 different fraud types that can affect the NHS. It's a big organisation, so inevitably, we'll see some fraud. That can involve members of the public getting access to services that they're not entitled to. It could involve staff, sadly, getting an unfair advantage. But we also have a lot of suppliers and contractors that are engaged with the NHS. So we see bribery and corruption challenges as well.
You say about the size of it. Do you think that's partly the problem? Because the NHS is so big and the budget it has to work with, that's what leaves it susceptible to fraud?
Yeah, I mean, it's the NHS in England is the 5th biggest employer in the world. The budget is £155 billion. So I think it's right that there's a financial response that matches that. Just for some context, the deployment of an ambulance, for example, to a patient costs about £750. We all visit a GP, it normally lasts about 9 minutes. That's about £42. And there's millions of those that take place every year. So we need that money to go to the people who need those services and not to those who don't deserve it.
Absolutely. Have you any idea of the actual scale of what is lost to fraud?
Yeah, so sadly we estimate that the losses to fraud are in the region of £1.2 billion a year. It's a huge sum.
It's a massive amount of money. So is there anything that we, the public, can do to help this, bring that figure down?
So if you work for the NHS, and I think we all know somebody who does, or you have information about NHS fraud, then you can report on our website, which is cfa.nhs.uk, or we also have a confidential reporting hotline, which is hosted by Crime Stoppers. We have dedicated fraud specialists who can take those calls and respond appropriately, and we'd really like to hear from people.
Brilliant, Alex. Thank you for coming in and raising awareness on a clearly important issue.